Thank you, Bay. And thank you all for coming tonight. So, how many of you are doing the Wednesday night 16 guidelines that are here? Good, good. That's great. Yeah, it's a wonderful course. I've taught something similar on while using the 16 as like a methodology for studying them, getting familiar with them. Some of them will be repeated actually in some of what I'm going to share tonight. Let's just start with a short meditation, though. It's always good to spend a little time in silence before we begin, just to focus our minds a bit. No doubt we've all had very full days, but might have things that are kind of carrying over into your time here. So we want to be able to let some of that go by first focusing on the breath. So most of you, I'm sure, have some sort of a breathing meditation practice that you can do. If you need any instruction, just tune into the sensation at the tip of the nose. That's one way to work with the breath, where you feel the sensation of the air coming in and going out. That's a nice point to focus on, particularly at the end of the day when our minds are a little tired. It kind of brings the mind up a bit. Just try to stay present with the breath as best as you can. And when you see that the mind has wandered away from the breath, then just let go of whatever distracted you and gently guide the mind back to the breath. So I'll ring the chime to start the meditation period, and then I'll come in just a few minutes and we'll have a little reflection before we start. So now let's just do a short reflection before we begin. So to do this, I thought it would be useful just to touch on a few points from Monday night. And one is that in Western psychology, there's a lot of emphasis on positive emotions as well. But in Buddhism, we're talking about those emotions that have a greater impact on our well-being over the long term. They might not necessarily even feel good to experience, but they are useful for us in terms of our spiritual growth. So we can acknowledge that we're all here to some degree to explore what these positive emotions are in Buddhism so we can adopt them in our own lives and see that more long-term and lasting effect on our experience and on our well-being. But moreover, in Buddhist psychology, we are using the cultivation of positive emotions as a way to overcome our negative tendencies and eventually to be able to even eliminate them, which in Western psychology is simply unheard of. So this is the idea that we want to bring to our motivation for being here, that we're going to learn more about these positive emotions tonight as a way to help us to reduce our negative tendencies and to eventually be free of them once and for all. We can do that initially from our own perspective. How wonderful it would be if we never had another moment of anger, another moment of jealousy, or greed, or any of these other destructive emotions. And perhaps we can also enlarge our motivation by thinking we're here to work on ourselves, so we then can help others to do the same work. When we look at the world that we live in, we see that we're not the only ones who have these crazy states of mind. We're not the only ones that are seeking for more peace, more satisfaction, more happiness. So let's try to be here with both our own needs as well as the needs of all other beings within the scope of our motivation. This is how we make our minds very, very powerful so that everything we do tonight becomes a cause for that eventual result. All beings being led to their full potential, eliminating their negative tendencies completely, and developing their positive qualities to a limitless degree. Okay, and then you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. Okay. So again, I did have some of what most of what I shared on Monday, I think I did talk about in the motivation. I try to do that so that way I don't have to review quite as much. But again, in this course, these two sessions are really primarily looking at the Buddhist perspective on what we call positive emotions, which, as I was saying, are those things that not necessarily, they might not feel good at the moment. There might be a little bit of difficulty in getting our heads around them, but we cultivate them with a specific purpose to be able to develop our hearts and our minds to a greater degree. I mean, one of them we're going to look at tonight that is an example of that is compassion. You know, when we're talking about the mind of compassion, it means looking at suffering, being aware of suffering, opening our eyes, ears, whatever, to the reality of suffering in our world as well as in ourselves. That's not a pleasant place to be sometimes, but it's the way we grow our heart. So again, compassion isn't on the list of the 10 that Barbara Fredrickson, who's done a lot of research around positivity, it's not on the list of those because those tend to be, again, things that are positive emotions in a slightly different way. They do make us feel good. They do make us feel well in the moment. You know, they have some positive effect that we can, see and notice right away. So I don't know. Maybe we'll have the sharing a little bit later. It's Mary Kay, right? I think that you had talked about sharing something from the Navajo perspective, but did you want to do that now or do that later? Are you? Oh, you did. Oh, okay, please. That would be great. And then I can use that in another course, perhaps. Yeah. But thank you so much for offering that. And let's go ahead then. I'm going to go ahead and start with, well, let me preface this slide because again, we're about midway through my slides. The slides I showed on Monday night, we ended with the idea of, again, looking at how Buddhism teaches that we can use our positive emotions by building them up, make them a counterforce to the negative tendencies. That's how I'm going to be approaching our discussion of 10 individual positive emotions that we're going to do tonight. Before we get into that, though, I want to introduce you to something that's called the Four Great Efforts. These are things that are taught in Buddhism, pretty much all schools of Buddhism, as the main things that we are about in terms of, okay, if this is the goal to eventually eliminate our negativities through developing our positive qualities, well, these all fit together very nicely. The first two pertain to our negative states. So we can say the first effort we make is to prevent from arising negative states that have not arisen. So we try to be kind of guarding our mind to make sure that our jealousy, anger, whatever doesn't arise as much as possible. But then the second one, to let go of negative states once they have arisen, to have some tools we can use to counteract them so that they don't take over and start running away with our minds towards all sorts of unpleasant results. The third one is to give rise to positive states that have not yet arisen, exactly like the first one, except we're talking about, giving rise to the ones that are not there in the moment to cultivate more positive states that will be more healthier for ourselves and others. And then the fourth, to sustain positive states once they have arisen. So these four great efforts just really encapsulate what the whole Buddhist path is about. It's really about looking at the negative states, doing what we can to keep them from arising, or if they've arisen, to squelch them, to reduce them. And they are actually in tandem with the positive qualities. If we can make the positive qualities arise, there's no room for the negative. And they more or less, again, I'm going to pair them up with negative states tonight, a number of these, they more or less offset them. We talked about on Monday night about how if you have a mind of love, loving kindness towards other beings, how you cannot have the mind of hatred arising. It is a direct block to that because the mind of hatred is looking at other sentient beings in terms of negative qualities, tendencies, what have you, and having that, hateful stance towards them that doesn't want them to continue to be here, wants to get them out of our field of awareness, whatever. Whereas the mind of loving kindness is exactly the opposite. We're looking at the pleasant things about beings, wanting them to be happy, wanting them to have the fulfillment of their welfare. All of those are, again, don't allow for hatred to arise. This is the whole logic of Buddhist psychology, is if we further and develop all these positive states, well, then, we can create the impossibility, actually, for the negative tendencies to arise. I want to talk about, in regard to these four great efforts, just some necessary skills. This isn't a whole course in mindfulness and all these other things, but I do have to mention some of these factors because you can make some change in your mind by just simply saying, okay, I'm going to, not be so angry. I'm going to try to have a mind of patience and what have you. But I think it takes a little more than just that thought. It starts with willingness, what's on the screen now, willingness to change within the understanding that we can. Once more, our minds are not fixed in stone. Our minds can change. This is one of the most wonderful things about our minds. We might have certain tendencies at times in our lives, but those do not dictate every moment of our lives. We can let those go. We can find a way to reduce those. So willingness to change is a big one. If we're not willing to change, I think I'd shared with some of you before, I saw this one little cartoon on Facebook and had two panels. The top panel had like a politician or somebody saying, "Who wants change?" And everybody's got their hand up like, we all want change. And then the second panel was, "Who wants to change?" And everybody's got their hand down. You need the willingness to change. You're never going to get the results that you seek unless you actually put the energy into doing the change that's necessary. So this is a big one. Doesn't sound like much, but it's actually a pretty big word, this willingness. Secondly is meditation that includes the practice of mindfulness and what we call introspection in order to bring presence and awareness of what is happening in the mind. We often talk about how we want to become our own therapist. Well, the only way you can become your own therapist is by attending to your own mind. This is why all of the Buddhist traditions and many other contemplative traditions rely heavily upon meditation, because without a practice of going inward and looking at our minds, it's impossible to know what's going on and to be correctly identifying things. Venerable Rabina, who many of you know, Australian nun who's just quite amazing, one of my teachers, um, she always speaks about how we have like these crazy roommates in our mind. There's anger and there's jealousy and there's, all these other, and we have to get to know those roommates. Sometimes they sound like they're our best friends, but they're actually crazy roommates. They're actually ones that we don't necessarily want to hang out with, right? Because even we can see the way that sometimes when we get upset at somebody who's doing something, we think that that is protecting ourselves, in some way helping us to have some happiness. But it doesn't lead us down that path. It eventually will cause us problems. Might feel good in the moment a little bit, but it's not going to solve the problem. So we need to know what's going on in our minds. These two factors that are mentioned here, mindfulness, this is a big word in not just Buddhism, but in our secular world, right? I think they even use the term McMindfulness because it's gotten to be so, it's like McDonald's everywhere, right? It's just generic in a sense, but it's a very powerful tool that, again, not only the Buddha taught, but many Eastern traditions, and certainly, in the West, they're seeing the value of it now. It's staying present with what is going on in our minds, not allowing the mind to forget what it is that we are doing. So if we're meditating on a particular topic, or we are out and about doing, trying to keep our mind in a particular vein, we can't let go of that. We can't forget that. It is built up as we do practice on the cushion. The whole reason of doing practice on the cushion is so that when you're off the cushion, you can do what you need to do. Now, meditation practice is very important. Once more, it's a tool, something that we use to enhance the quality of our attentiveness, our mind. So the second thing that was mentioned there was introspection. Introspection is said to be kind of like a spy in the corner of our mind. We have to occasionally check in and see the quality of our minds. You can't just trust that you're going to maintain that mindfulness. Perhaps you need to check in occasionally and go, hey, what's really going on here? Are you staying on track, or have you gone astray? And if we find that we've gone astray, well, then we need to restore our mindfulness, become aware once more of how it is that we want to be in the world, the sorts of positive emotions that we want to be cultivating, and so on. So mindfulness and introspection work kind of hand in hand. You maintain your mindfulness as best as you can while you are focused on whatever you're doing, but we occasionally need to check in and see if we've lost some of that, or if it's, somehow changed in a way that we need to correct. That's the force of our introspection. So these are two tools that you use in your meditation, right? Like, what did I say in the instruction tonight, right? You bring your awareness to the breath. That's going to be maintaining your mindfulness of the breath. But then when you see that the mind has wandered, then you guide the mind gently back to the breath. Those are those two things, mindfulness and introspection. Okay? So kind of demystifying those two words. When they're both present and we have kind of a good maintaining of our mind and focus, well, then we have concentration. We have what we call samadhi, meditative stabilization. And again, that can happen on the cushion, but it's so that we have it when we get up off the cushion. Let's go to the next slide. This is the last thing that I'm highlighting, but I think this is an important aspect of our practice. An inquiry or questioning that we bring to bear so that we can become our own therapist, analyze what needs to be done differently, and respond accordingly. So it's not just enough that we have a correction of what's going on. We have to be kind of seeing what's going on, analyzing, actually looking at what's happening in our minds. Our minds are very tricky. Our minds will find ways of justifying things that are not necessarily good things to do, because that's what they've been doing with us all along. It sounds strange. We're not trying to make our mind into another person. We're just saying that the habitual patterns that we have tend to surface at times and convince us that we need to do something different that is not necessarily, again, going to be the best thing for us. We actually have to be our own therapists, questioning continually. Is this the best thing to do at this point? Is this what I want to follow? Is these the thoughts that I think will be beneficial for whatever is going on in that particular situation? So it does involve some kind of curiosity even about our minds, so that we become intimately connected to what's going on in our minds, and we know how to change our minds accordingly. So I don't know. Those are three things that I think I've found in my own practice that are really important. The degree to which we can engage in a formal meditation practice, as was, on that previous slide, is a major factor. I think without that, it's very hard to change the mind a lot. A little quote from Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, most of you know, was in the Auschwitz in Nazi Germany. Well, it was in Poland actually, but under the Nazi regime, and managed to survive and wrote a wonderful book called Man's Search for Meaning. And he says, between the stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. I love this quote because it's essentially what we're once more trying to do with Buddhism. And what I like to point out, I like to use the word reaction for what we habitually do to any particular stimulus. So we have this, again, our minds are very malleable. So we have gotten used to certain negative ways of doing things. And so we keep reacting. And that's why I like this word reaction. We're reacting, keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. And what's that phrase? Thinking you're going to get different results. That's a definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, thinking somehow it's going to work out this time. Well, instead of reacting, we have to see that there's a stimulus, something that is going to happen, or a situation we're in, or whatever is going on in our world. And there's the response to that. And there's a space that we can create between those two where we can actually choose how to respond. The word respond is wonderful because it's the root for responsible, responsibility. I want to be responsible in how I am in the world, not reacting all the time. And not technically defined this way. If you go to like a Webster's dictionary, it's not going to kind of give that tuning to it. But that's the way I like to phrase these. So we recall again that we want to be able to respond more effectively. We want to be able to hold states of mind that are going to be more productive for ourselves and others, because those are the source of greater well-being. We called this little two-night thing the science of happiness. That's Buddhist science in terms of determining what sorts of minds we have. The quality of our mind will be have a greater happiness and well-being when we respond effectively, when we actually see things more accurately and do things that are more in line with this principle of attributing, certain qualities that are going to give us better well-being in the long term. Putting our money onto compassion and loving kindness and patience and all these things that might be very hard to develop, but are going to pay off in the long term. They're going to make us much better at responding to what goes on in our world. The results of the election, whatever it is that is going to happen in the near future, we will be in a better position to respond if we actually invest in these sorts of things. So this is where we're going to go for the remainder of my time with you for tonight, is to take a look at these. I put together 10. Some of you will certainly recognize these, especially the first 4, because they are often called the 4 immeasurable thoughts. They are positive thoughts that we can have, and we'll go into each of these in more detail. The 5th one is patience, which of course we know is a very, what do they say? Patience is a virtue. It is definitely a virtue in Buddhism as well as many other traditions. Humility, forgiveness, contentment, gratitude, generosity. Rather than going through these 10 right now, I'm going to go into them individually. But you'll notice that in both of these slides, I put what they counter. There's a negative tendency, a reaction that we tend to have that can be countered by the more responsible way of working with that situation. So let's go through these and you'll see, hopefully, as it all unfolds, what it is that we are doing with these 10. The very first one, it's called equanimity. This isn't a word we use maybe in English language all that much. In Buddhism, it's got like 3 different meanings. The meaning we're attributing here is what's said on the screen by Kathleen MacDonald. Equanimity is an unbiased, impartial attitude that regards all beings as equally deserving of our respect and concern, our love and compassion. So you'll notice that it counters that sense of kind of bias or partiality. Well, what do we mean by that? Let me explain this. I'll do it as quickly as I can, but yet give you the full picture. We naturally divide beings into 3 different camps. We have some beings that we're quite close to. We consider those to be our friends, the people that are in that circle of making us feel good, right? And the distortion we often have with them is that we get attached to them. And that's a mind that's about me. It's like, I want these beings in my life because they please me and they give me what I need. That's the distortion we have with regard to them. Because, of course, what happens if they do something that displeases us? They're often like booted out, you know, they have to go to the other camp. The other camp are the beings who are our enemies, the difficult people. And those might be people that have done something directly to harm you or those that you love. But you very naturally have an attitude towards them that is a bias. In terms of, you might have hatred towards them, you might have anger, whatever, all these negative emotions that don't like them and are pushing them away from our experience as best as we can, but certainly disagreeing with them, having lots of problems with them. That's a distortion. Because once more, those beings who are our enemies sometimes become our friends. Yeah. When I was working and living in San Francisco, working at Levi Strauss, there was a woman that I worked with at one time. I couldn't get along with at all. We had the hardest relationship, and she moved to another department. And then a few years later, I worked with her on a project, and I really got to see a whole other side of her. She came to be somebody, very close. So it's like we are not seeing the full picture with either of those distorted attitudes. We're holding a bias towards them that is based on one little segment of an experience, and it's painting the whole picture that way. Then are, of course, the third group. The third camp are like all the other beings that we call strangers. Pema Chodron calls them neutrals. They don't really elicit any strong emotion because we don't know them yet. They haven't broken into our field of awareness as a friend or an enemy. So we just kind of see them on the periphery and don't really think much of them. But that's still a distortion. We have this mind of indifference towards them, which is usually there. Sometimes strangers break through to us, right? We might see on the news all the children in Gaza or something that are, suffering from what's happening there. And we decide, oh, that really breaks my heart. And I need to send money to Red Cross or whatever to aid those beings. Strangers do break through occasionally, but generally we don't have any of these distortions to them. We don't have a strong closeness in wanting to pull them into our lives. We don't have this repulsion wanting to push them out of our lives. They're just kind of there with this indifference. This is what we're trying to equalize. This is the equanimity that just gets rid of these three attitudes. You're still going to have these three camps, right? Because we can't possibly have everybody in the friend camp. It just doesn't work that way. Our world is more complicated than that, right? Not everybody's going to be a friend. Some are still going to be strangers. Few are going to be difficult people, enemies. So we need to equalize ourselves with regard to them, to have an equal regard for them, because we begin to see different things about them. And let me put this on the screen now and go through a little bit of what I've done for each of these. And I'm going to make a copy of these slides available through Bay. She'll make sure if you put your email address over there, or if you registered, then you'll have copies of all this. I put together a brief meditation that you can do, as well as, and this is very brief, there are much longer ways of approaching this, but then as well as I'm going to put together, the next slide will be a little practice, which means something that you can maybe do occasionally, and then a mindfulness exercise, something that you can maybe try to practice when you've had some exposure to this and you can maintain more mindfulness of it throughout your day. The meditation says, in order to overcome the distorted attitudes towards the three, again, the attachment towards a friend, the indifference to strangers, the anger, resentment towards enemies, reflect on their equality in terms of, first, the transitory nature of these relationships. That's what I was already mentioning. Things change over time. In a lifetime, things change. In Buddhism, we have many lifetimes, so not everybody's been in the same camp throughout every lifetime. And as I said, within this life, beings are moving from one section to the other. Somebody who's an enemy becoming a friend, somebody who's a stranger becoming an enemy, someone who's a friend over time becoming a stranger. We wouldn't even recognize them on the street. That's the first way you could look at it. The other way that I often point out, because I think it's really helpful, is the differing relationships that they have to others. That person who's in our enemy camp, for example, might be a dear friend to somebody else, right? It goes without saying. People who are an enemy in that camp don't necessarily manifest as an enemy for everybody else. Somebody likes them, you know? So who's right? The people who are seeing this as a friend and having that, nice relationship with them, or me seeing them as an enemy? Kind of begins to undermine the solidity that we put on these labels that we have on people. right? And we begin to see that they're not so reliable because they change throughout our lives. They also change, are different in regard to who's perceiving them. Yeah, and it's something that's part of our world. But the other way, maybe one of the deeper ways that we can see their equality is their sameness in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. This is one of the things that is taught in almost every Buddhist class, it seems. I often use it in setting our motivation, but it's a truth that we can come to know ourselves. Can you think of anyone you know, any being that you know, even animals in this world, that are not motivated at that very basic level to seek what brings happiness and to avoid what brings suffering? I mean, even animals, when you watch those animal nature shows, right? If they see the shadow of the bird up in the sky, all the little prairie dogs go in the hole or whatever. They don't want to lose their life. They don't want to be the next meal for that, winged terror that's in the sky. So essentially, every being is trying to get away from what will bring suffering and is gravitating towards what will bring happiness. And the Buddha said that's the basic starting point for everything the Buddha taught. The problem is most beings don't know how to achieve those goals. How do you actually achieve happiness, not just in the moment, but in a more lasting way, even to the point where that's all that you experience is happiness and well-being? And how do you avoid suffering? How do you actually stop creating the causes for suffering? And these are what the Buddha taught about for the 45 years that he taught, and what we try to follow in this tradition and all Buddhist traditions, essentially. So, this way of looking at beings is very much about seeing the sameness. Whoever it is that is the presidential candidate that you don't want to win next Tuesday, that person is the same as the other candidate in that very fundamental way. Want to be happy, don't want to suffer. Now, you might look at them and think they're very misguided in how they're going about accomplishing that. But hey, the Buddha says we're all misguided in terms of how we're doing that. So we just have to be honest with ourselves and look at others through that lens of saying they're all at the same starting point of simply wanting this, and maybe even add, and they're also all a bit distorted in terms of how they're going about achieving it. But that should equalize the playing field so we have an equal regard for all beings because we're all in the same predicament, essentially. So that's the idea behind equanimity. It doesn't sound like it's got, again, some of these don't have a huge positive charge to them, like in the Western psychology approach to positive emotions. But over time, if we live our lives day in and day out, seeing beings through that lens, well, then we're having a different experience with every being that we meet, whether they are holding the sign of the candidate that we don't want, or whether they're holding the sign of the candidate that we do want, or whatever they are doing. We're able to see them through the same lens. So that's the meditation in essence. As I said, there are many more steps you can do with that, but I wanted to at least give you that. In terms of a practice, I think what's kind of interesting is, especially with what's going on in our world, as you read or watch the news or other media, if you do that, I'm sure we all come across some sort of news at one point or another. Even when you pull up your email, sometimes you're getting, some sort of feed with something going on. Try to see whoever is being discussed or whoever is kind of being presented without any bias. See that again, having hatred, having attachment, having indifference, that all of these are problematic. We want to be able to have an equal regard that is somewhat positive. I'm not saying again that we're at the stage of developing love and compassion for these beings yet. That comes next. But at least to have a mind that's free of those sort of distortions. And then in terms of a mindfulness exercise, as you work with this, as you encounter others, whether they are in that category of friend, enemy, or stranger, try to see them with equal regard, all equally worthy of concern. I mean, I'm always kind of blown away when I think about equanimity. It's said to be in these four immeasurables. It's the first one often in the Mahayana presentation, this branch of Buddhism, because it sets the stage for how you can accomplish the other three. But it's really powerful in and of itself. Could we imagine a world where beings didn't have hatred for any other being, didn't have, attachment to any other beings, didn't have indifference towards any other beings? Man, that's pretty powerful. Just practicing equanimity means that your heart is going to be open to whoever you meet. You're going to have the potential to be concerned about them because you're not going to have these biases. Does it make some sense? Let's go on to the next one. The next two really, again, are built on this premise that all beings want happiness and don't want to suffer. Therefore, number two is loving kindness, which we call it loving kindness because it's really to differentiate it from what we might call romantic love. Romantic love has an element of this to it, but it also has a lot of attachment because when we are romantically involved with somebody, it's all about this person is meeting my needs, and so we love them because they are doing that for us, and they love us because we're doing that for them. And so it becomes very selfish from that perspective. But yet we can have a regard for them in terms of wanting them to have happiness as well, extending that, in that direction. So this is described by Kathleen MacDonald as the desire for happiness that unites all beings, human and non-human. So feeling love for others means acknowledging this desire, that basic starting point, respecting it, and doing what we can to fulfill it. Again, fulfill it within the capacity that we have in our interactions with others, but at least with our thoughts. If we could meet others from a place of loving kindness, of a genuine wish for them to have that desire for happiness fulfilled, that's already, again, really powerful in our world. That would be a way beyond even just, okay, I don't have the attachment, I don't have the anger, but what if I had this unconditional regard for them that made me want to be involved in their happiness, wanting them to be happy, and even if I can, to help them to become happy. Again, that's another step in this. So this kind of love, as she says, is sometimes called loving kindness, as I said, to distinguish it from love that is mixed with lust or selfish attachment. Loving kindness is pure, unselfish, and unconditional. We use that phrase sometimes, right? Unconditional love. Now, again, I could talk about each of these for much longer, but I'm going to go on and give you the advice in terms of working with them. That's my goal in this course, is not just to give you these things and say, well, good luck working with them. I mean, I want to give you some direction so you know what to do. And I wouldn't, by the way, I would say, don't feel like you have to adopt all 10 of these. Maybe look at the list, think about it after tonight's class, and say, well, what can I work on now? What might be most beneficial for my mind and my heart right now? And it might be number 10, it might be number 1, it might be number 5. These aren't in a particular order, other than I started with the 4 measurables because it's a nice place to start, something many of us have some connection to. So the meditation is working with, it is good to work with each of the 3 categories in turn, friends, strangers, and enemies. Reflect on their wish for happiness, generating love towards them in the 3 stages. I do point out 3 ways of advancing our loving kindness. The first one is simply to think how wonderful it would be if they had happiness. So, whoever we're looking at, and maybe we start with friends because friends is easiest. So think about the person who's dearest to you. It should be quite easy to generate these thoughts, right? How wonderful it would be if my dear partner, my pet, my mother, my son, daughter, whatever, how wonderful it would be if they had happiness. May they have happiness is a bit stronger. It's kind of like you're making a decree, like, may this be so. May it not just be something we can go, oh, that would be wonderful. May this actually happen. The third one is taking some level of responsibility. And this, again, is our Mahayana perspective, and Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, Chan Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism. Many of these are part of what we call the Mahayana branch, where we take that personal responsibility. I myself will place them in happiness. Now, again, it doesn't mean that in the moment we have to be out there attending to everyone's happiness all around us. Yes, do some of that. That's a good extension of this motivation. If we sit on our cushion and generate loving kindness, but then we never are loving towards anyone else, well, that's not a very good thing. But we mean I'm going to have a mind that wishes I could do that. Whoa, nice music. So we're going to have a mind that wants to accomplish that. Of course, in Buddhist terms, that's the mind that drives us to become a Buddha. As we mentioned on Monday night, you can become a Buddha by eliminating all the negative tendencies and developing all the positive ones. That's the result we're aiming for. So this third one, I'd say it's kind of optional to some degree, but this is really within our tradition, something we really want to emphasize. And I'm just going to say, oh yeah, may you have happiness. May that happen for you. And then say, but I'm not going to be involved in it. I'll let you figure that out. Let you work it out for yourself. The practice, something you could do occasionally, is as you read or watch the news again or other media. I use that for the first few here. I've got other ones later, but try to generate thoughts of loving kindness towards all who appear. So it's not just seeing them with an equal regard, without bias, like we did in the first one. Can you generate thoughts of love towards them? Again, you may not want to choose the person who is like the top of your list in terms of an enemy or difficult person, but see what happens when you start cultivating those thoughts. Because if beings, even your worst enemies, if they were to be actually happy, have a contentment inside them, a happiness inside them, they probably wouldn't be doing the things they're doing, right? Because they would be happy. They wouldn't be driven to causing problems and difficulties in our world and what have you, and saying things that are objectionable and what have you. The mindfulness practice, of course, is when you are more familiar with this, when you encounter any being, try to see them with what I'm calling the eyes of love. We're going to see eyes of compassion on the next one, which is compassion, which I think is a term that Thich Nhat Hanh adopted. But eyes of love, eyes of compassion, it's the same thing in terms of looking at two different perspectives, but seeing beings through that. Eyes of love, we are wanting them to be happy, have that. Eyes of compassion are wanting them to be free from suffering. So this is again, a way that we actually make this a reality for us. It counters hatred. I mentioned on Monday night that you cannot have hatred present in the mind when loving kindness is present. I even said it earlier tonight. It's just impossible. These are diametrically opposed. You're looking at a being here with loving kindness and wanting them to be happy, and you're looking at a being over here with hatred that often wants them to suffer, certainly doesn't want them to have happiness. It's not possible to have these both in the mind at the same time. Now, with difficult people, we may vacillate. We may have a little bit of loving kindness, but then we revert back to our hatred towards them. That's okay. That's how you get there. Don't expect that you can flip a switch and suddenly you've got equanimity, loving kindness, compassion for all beings. If that switch existed, it would have been flipped a long time ago for all of us, right? We would have learned how to do that. So let's go on to compassion. I'll stop maybe after these four just to check in about any questions so people are kind of all on the same page. Compassion is, again, the response to the suffering in the world and the suffering that we see in beings. It arises out of our own experience of suffering. We all know what it's like to be sick or in pain, to be lonely or have our feelings hurt by an unkind remark, to fear the unknown or grieve the death of a loved one. So we can relate to the suffering of others from our own intimate experience with it. If we aren't open to our own suffering, then perhaps we do have some blockage to that. But when we then see or hear of others going through similar experiences, our heart opens with a feeling of empathy. This is the root of compassion, and the wish to help, which is how compassion becomes more active in our world. This is compassion, the wish for oneself and others to be free from suffering, free from all painful, unwanted, unsatisfactory experiences. Again, it's the response that we should have instead of our habitual reaction, which again can sometimes be that indifference when we see suffering and we don't really care, or with the enemies, we might have a wish for them to suffer, because we don't like them and we'd rather see them suffer than be free of that. And we can see it can get pretty distorted. But compassion is really at the root of so much of our practice, so important. I think the Buddha once said it's the sum of all of our practice when it comes down to it. So compassion acknowledges that everyone wants to be free of suffering, deserves to be free of suffering, and has that capacity. So this is, again, a very important emotion, positive emotion in Buddhism. It counters cruelty, harmfulness. They say that this is sort of its direct opposite. I might point out that they do say that there are, again, that's kind of what they often say, the far enemy or opposite. They often talk about near enemies to compassion. I just want to point this out because I think it's a really useful teaching. I hope I don't run out of time to get to all 10 of these, but sometimes we develop something that is more akin to pity. When we use the word pity, again, maybe this isn't a technical definition, but there is a sense of superiority with pity. Where like if you're walking on the street and someone's sitting on the side of the street and they look up at you with, very, empty eyes and looking for you to offer some money to them, you can kind of look it down on them and say, oh, me from my lofty place up here, and I'll take out some money and I'll throw it to you, so I can kind of do my good deed of the day or something. It's not really compassion. Compassion means to feel with, to suffer with. It's a more distant way of trying to alleviate suffering. It's fine. If that's where your mind is at, still good that you give money or do whatever you can to help others. But recognize that it's probably more akin to pity. It's called a near enemy because we could be practicing that all the time and think we're being compassionate, but it's not really compassionate. Because once more, as Kathleen MacDonald pointed out in the slide I showed, it means starting with identifying our own suffering. Sometimes when I teach on compassion, there's this little cartoon of like a homeless person who's holding up a mirror, and the person who's coming there sees themselves reflected in that person. And that's what we mean by that empathy and that being able to feel the suffering of another, to think that that could be me on the sidewalk, sitting there wanting money, needing money. Right? So it's very different feeling to it. It's not a feeling of superiority at all that pity has. The other one that's a near enemy is when we are so identifying with the suffering of another that we become overwhelmed with it. And this happens very often in our world. I mean, look at the suffering that we have in our world. People even say that, right? I can only watch the news so much, or I can only pay so much attention to it because it's too painful. Well, that painful feeling, I mean, you are touching on that connection with empathy of another, but you're only getting that kind of emotional component of it, what we call the affective empathy. The affective empathy is where you are identifying with the suffering of another, but you could get out of balance and lost in that. You need a more cognitive empathy that goes along with that. That cognitive empathy is what keeps compassion from becoming this overwhelm, where you say, okay, yes, this is going on in my world. These are the things I have to be aware of, but I need to then work with that. I need to do something with that. If it's an individual situation, it means I need to help you address your suffering. Like they say, for example, if you were a friend called up and said, "Oh my God, I just got home and my house has been robbed. I burgled. Everything's gone. I'm really just, so distressed right now." We'd go running over there, and say, okay, sit down, let me make you a cup of tea or whatever, and try to take care of them. And you'd hear what they were feeling and everything, and you'd be empathic with them. And then if you just sit there and you're getting more and more distressed, the more that you listen to them, where you just become like tears and everything in their presence, that's not going to be so helpful. They need somebody who can also take charge and do some things that will help them to address what's happened and maybe, call the police and have somebody come. That's the cognitive empathy side of it. I'm just saying that again, when our compassion gets out of whack, it might be because we don't have that proper balance in our empathy. We're looking at things solely from the perspective of what they're feeling and identifying with it too strongly to where it feels like just too heavy. So at those times, pull back a bit and see what it is that you can actually do about the situation. Again, if it's something that's distant, like what's going on in Gaza or what have you, well, then you get out your checkbook perhaps or go online and you make some sort of contribution to the efforts helping there. That can make you feel good, like you're responding to it in an effective way, rather than I'm just going to sit around and cry all night, and doesn't do much good, right? So let's go back to our little practice here. The practice is very similar. It just has slightly different words because we are looking at the suffering of others rather than wishing them to be happy. So I got two meditations for this because we do have to start with self-compassion. Now, sure, it's good to start with self-love too, but there's a lot more emphasis on self-compassion because of what I just pointed out. Because if you don't start drawing from your own experience of suffering, then it's very hard to identify with the suffering of another, and it might become more like pity, where we have perhaps more of the cognitive side of it, but we don't have a feeling with the other person. So reflecting on it, this is from Kristen Neff. This is what she calls her self-compassion break. Reflecting on a particularly difficult situation you are dealing with generates self-compassion. And she says using three phrases. Now, these phrases are not cast in stone. You can adapt them for your own meditation. This is a moment of suffering. That means you just have to acknowledge that what you're going through is hard, is difficult. And we all have moments where we're not very kind to ourselves. We just kind of skirt over those and we just toughen up. And, that's that whole Western kind of Lone Ranger kind of mentality. I'm just going to plow right through it and forget it. I'm not suffering. Well, it's good to treat yourself with that kind of tenderness, to say, guess what? I am suffering, not feeling so great. This is a tough time. The second one is this is a part of our shared humanity. This helps you to have it stop kind of collapsing in completely, where you recognize that this is part of being a human being in this world, that you're going to have suffering. You're going to have difficulties. You're going to be separated from the people that you love. You're going to have to be ill and have all kinds of things happen in this life that are not desirable. It's part of being human. Don't think that it's anything, horribly unique, but this also helps you to identify with the suffering of others. To say, was that phrase we used during the pandemic, right? We're all in this together. We're all in the same boat. Well, essentially, we are. This is what it means to be a human being, to have these types of experiences. The last one is, may I be kind to myself in this moment, which can look like many different things. Kristen Neff says you could even like hug yourself or put your hand on your heart, something that feels nurturing for you, whatever that might be. And then just send thoughts to yourself that are nurturing, comforting. May I be free of this suffering. May I find some ease and peace in my life. This is where, again, if we check how we talk to ourselves generally when we have things going on, we're not talking to ourselves that way at all. The fact they say that if we talk to others the way we talk to ourselves, we wouldn't have any friends at all. Like if somebody came to you and said, I'm having a really bad time, and we'd say, oh, get over it. What do you do? What are you doing? Things aren't so bad. Then people would be like, whoa, I'll go talk to someone else, because that's not what we're looking for, right? So what we have to be for ourselves at that time with self-compassion is exactly like a dear friend would be for us, like to say, oh, I'm sorry that you're feeling that way. I wish that that wasn't happening for you. Again, you can find so much more at self-compassion.org, I think is the name of her website. Kristen Neff, Neff. Number two is, of course, when you extend that to other beings. And this looks very much like the meditation on loving kindness, where you work with the three groups in stages. Start with friends, people who we're naturally going to open our hearts to with compassion, strangers, and then enemies, and reflect on their wish to not suffer. Generating compassion in the three stages, very similar. How wonderful if they were not suffering. May they be free from suffering, and I myself will free them. So I don't need to say more about that. Again, I won't spend more time on it. But that's where we should always start with ourselves, especially with compassion, so that we make sure that we identify with the suffering of others in a more intimate way, because we're suffering as well. So the practice, this is the last time I think I work with the news. Maybe there's one more time, I don't remember. But as you read or watch the news or other media, try to generate thoughts of compassion towards all who appear. And particularly, again, it could be really challenging with those figures that we don't like, politicians or people in the entertainment industry or whoever, and they appear and based on things that you've heard that they said or that they've done, you don't want them to be free from suffering. You don't have that wish naturally. But what's it like is we're exposed to a variety of things, because that's what I like about if you watch the news, you'll see some things where you go, oh, there's that person I like, and oh, there's that person I don't like. And you can go very quickly to like, okay, test it against this person, that person. Can I have compassionate thoughts with regard to all of them? Tough. Finally, the mindfulness practice, when you encounter any being, as Thich Nhat Hanh said, try to see them with the eyes of compassion. Most of you, maybe many of you even have met the Dalai Lama, or at least have gone to teachings with the Dalai Lama, where you've seen him from a distance, or certainly seen him on television, teachings, what have you, that are recorded. I mean, I think he's doing this all the time, right? He's just really in that place of genuine compassion for whoever it is that is there in front of him, or the way that he's even teaching to a larger audience. You kind of get that sense that there's a being who's very concerned about you. I remember when His Holiness came to San Francisco in 2007. I wasn't living there then, but I came up from Santa Fe with a group of people from our center. And I stayed with a friend of mine who's not Buddhist, but she really has this kind of affinity for the Dalai Lama. And so Dalai Lama was giving a public talk as part of that visit. And I said, well, I've got to buy a ticket for my friend to go so she can go with me and be, in the presence of His Holiness. And when he came into the room, and you know how he comes in and he's bowed over and bowing at everybody, and And she just lost it. She just had like these tears just flowing down her face. And it was because of that unconditional love and compassion of this being, and she could feel it, sense it, know it, you know. So, I mean, we see that this is possible to be like this. These are the exercises that get you to be like that, essentially. So you live from that place of having these attitudes of equanimity, loving kindness, compassion with anyone you meet and everyone you meet. So those three are really important. The fourth one that is a part of the four immeasurables is joy, which I'm describing here as a very specific form of joy. In fact, in the Book of Joy with His Holiness and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, they talk about Paul Ekman identifying, I don't know how many different definitions of joy. I think I mentioned this the other night. But one of them that is really important is the joy and rejoicing that counters jealousy. By the way, the compassion counters cruelty, harmfulness towards others. I didn't mention that earlier, but I think that's a bit obvious, right? With joy and rejoicing, what we mean is that we're going to get rid of the normal attitude, our habitual reaction of being jealous when people have things that we don't have, right? We feel bad because we wish we had them for ourselves. Here, we're going to take delight in them having that. So this is taking delight in the happiness, success, and good fortune of others. And this is one of the ways that we practice joy. In fact, you will find it's not that hard to find joy in the happiness of others. It is something we already experience naturally. Well, we certainly experience it with people who are close to us. If you have a friend that calls you and they said, "Oh, you won't believe the most wonderful thing happened," and they go on to tell you about something somebody did for them or something that, they got a promotion or their child did something really wonderful or whatever, and you feel good because you're sharing in their joy. In fact, Master Shantideva, the great Indian Buddhist saint, he often talks about how if we're ever looking for sources of happiness, we should just rejoice in the happiness of others. You're never without that as a source of happiness. Because when you bring joy into your own heart, looking upon others experiencing something good, it's it's a win-win. They're having the wonderful experience and you're enjoying it with them. Now, it gets to be harder to rejoice in the good fortune of people who we don't like. That's why we need the previous attitudes. That's why we need especially equanimity. But rejoicing is a practice that you can do with regard to whoever is experiencing something good. So the meditation is to reflect on the good actions, favorable experiences of both yourself and others, generating joy in your heart that takes delight in those. I didn't spell out working with friends, enemies, strangers anymore, but certainly you can work in that way. As I said, it's quite easy to rejoice in the, good qualities or good experiences that those that we love are having. When it comes to, those that we tend to not like so much, it's a little bit harder. But this is important to kind of extend, push the envelope a bit, and work with this idea of rejoicing. It's such an easy way to have joy in our hearts. The practice that I would encourage you to do is occasionally think about someone who has great wealth or high status. This is to help us push a little bit into that category of people who we look at and we go, God, they have so much money. They've got billions and billions. And you almost again have that. It might not be quite jealousy. It might even be just sort of a dismay and a disliking because they're in such a good situation, right? Reflect on their good fortune to have those, and also what good they must have done to acquire these. I'm just going to talk about this a little bit. In Buddhist terms, we don't get any positive qualities or any good results in our lives without having put the energy into creating the causes for that. And the causes for having good things in your lives are that you had some acts of generosity in the past to where you now have those resources in your life. So if we look at a billionaire, for example, a billionaire, we might think, oh, it's whatever they did in this life. Somehow they had some good luck and they had the right people around them and somehow they made all this money and have become a billionaire. In Buddhist terms, it's because they created the karma for that. They created the actions in the past that have ripened into that good fortune. So we can rejoice. And again, it wasn't bad karma, it was good karma. It was the karma of generosity, the karma of giving, which is one of them coming up in our list here. Generosity is the means for having resources in your life. Having a good fit body that, excels in sports or whatever is because you have not harmed the bodies of others. All of these things come about through virtuous actions. So when we see others that have good fortune in this way and that are perhaps unrelatable, that we can't, get over the fact that they have so much money, well, they didn't get that from nowhere. that came from their own past actions. So you can rejoice because it was good actions that brought that about, and it's your own, rejoicing in that and their good situation. Again, that's a little tougher, but that's what that practice advice is about, is kind of helping us push the envelope a bit. Then the mindfulness thing, as you encounter others, try to see something about them in which you can rejoice. I think this is a wonderful exercise. Once we've done a bit of rejoicing on our own, anybody we see has something, and observing them, even just in the store, as somebody checking out in the aisle next to you, you can probably find something about them to rejoice in. Maybe they're wearing nice clothes. They might have, some expensive things they're buying. Well, then that means they've got some resources. They've got the money to pay for those things. You can rejoice in that. It's very simple. Or if someone is very attractive, they say attractive looks come from having practiced patience in the past. Well, that's a quality. That's a positive thing to engage in as well. So anything we see in somebody, we can hopefully find some way to rejoice in their good fortune. Now, there might be some people who we come across who don't have such good fortune in this life, but they probably still have something we can find to be, kind of sharing some joy in them with. And then we maybe get compassionate with them and want to do something to help alleviate their situation. That's why these four can work, very closely together. So let me just take it off screen for a minute to see how this is going and if people are kind of any questions or comments on what we talked about so far. And I can get a drink of water too. So there is some self-motivation, self-compassion. Anyone online or here in the Gompa? Yes, please. We'll get the microphone to you. Sorry. Yeah, we do want to make sure so the folks at home as well as the recording has your question or comment. Yeah,
Thank you.
please.
Just was wondering if you could explain near enemy again.
Sure.
Just a little confused with
Okay.
that. Thank you.
What we say, let's go back to compassion and talk about it. The far enemy is the direct thing that it is countering. So if we talk about the far enemy of compassion, it's when we can be cruel and harmful to others, right? That makes sense, right? Because that's the complete antithesis of being compassionate. If I'm compassionate, then I'm tending to the hurt or harm that beings are experiencing and being concerned about it. If I'm cruel, then I'm inflicting harm on other beings. The near enemies are just called that because they're not quite hitting the mark, but they seem near to it or close to it. So pity and overwhelm are two different states of mind that seem like we might be doing a good job with our compassion. But like with pity, it's fallen into a bit more of a egocentric kind of point of view where we're looking down on others. So our compassion isn't really genuine because we're really not feeling with them, trying to experience their suffering with a more deeper empathy. But then our overwhelm is almost identifying too much with the suffering to where we kind of drown in it, probably even worse than what they are drowning in it. We identify with it too much, and we feel like I can't handle the suffering of the world. I mean, that even sometimes causes people to take their own cherished lives because they can't stand to see the suffering of the world and feel kind of helpless in the face of that. So those two are near enemies because they come close to the feeling of compassion, but they miss the mark. So that's the idea.
It's the feeling is the enemy. Is what you're talking about is that
It's kind of again the pity itself that has an element of compassion in terms of seeing the suffering of another's, but it's missing the mark in terms of how it's being framed. I'm framing it from that superior vantage point. The overwhelm is where we have the feeling with completely without any kind of, again, cognitive way of standing back and acknowledging that still this is their suffering and we need to be in a different vantage point to try to address the suffering and wish for that suffering to be alleviated. So it has to do with the thoughts that are accompanying that. It might start with a compassion that is genuine, but it goes astray. And as I said, I would certainly rather have people have some level of pity and still help others, but it's much more genuine if they have that coming from compassion. So there's near enemies for some of these other ones, but I don't want to go too far into that rabbit hole. But they are things that we have to be careful because if we're not, we could end up thinking we're being very compassionate, but actually we're in overwhelm or we're in pity. Makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for asking about that. I know I'm explaining a lot of things very fast tonight. Venerable Rabina talks really quickly, and I've been told I'm a close second sometimes. So anyway,
Hi. Yeah. Hi,
yes,
John.
Jandy.
I get confused about wanting happiness for another person that you really care about and love, and you find yourself wanting to change them, and that feels egocentric.
Hmm,
So it's really hard to delineate that for me. I find
right.
I want them to have happiness. I see how they need to change.
We
You know
don't we
what
all?
I mean, but I don't want to get lost in that. But if you could clarify so that I can kind of wake up a little more about it.
Yeah, I mean, what you're bringing up, Jandy, is an important point that to have these thoughts of loving kindness and compassion towards other beings does mean that we are wanting to be intimately involved with their welfare. But once more, I mean, Buddhism is all about the fact that beings have to, in the end, change themselves. Even when we make those statements that I was pointing out in the meditation, I myself will place them in happiness. I myself will free them from suffering. We can say that's primarily to generate this kind of courageous element to what we're doing in our spiritual path so that we become dedicated to this path of full awakening, becoming a Buddha, and being able to help others more perfectly. Right now, we're not perfect in how we help others because our perception of them and what they need could be very much askew and related much more to ourselves. Well, if I could change these things about you, I'd be so much happier. Right? So we have to be really careful because, yeah, it becomes egocentric or it becomes distorted. Why? Because we don't have the wisdom that accompanies those thoughts. I'll point out now that, I mean, we have all of these things that we're talking about tonight, which are on the method side of the path, we call it. These are like two wings of a bird that we need to fly. And you can't do just the method side eventually without the wisdom side, without really knowing genuinely what needs to be done and having that come from a place of wisdom rather than a place of distortion and egocentricity. So yes, it's a balancing act until we get there. And as our wisdom grows, perhaps we can be more in tune and able to give advice and things that people might be able to listen to. But you might have the best advice in the world, but most people are not really willing to listen to you and change because that's not how human beings generally work. Yeah. I have a little joke that um, how many Buddhists does it take to change a light bulb? Well, it depends if it wants to change. You know, you know, it's up to the light bulb. I mean, in some way, it's up to that being. Who it's that back to that cartoon, right? Who wants change? Well, we all do. Who wants to change? Most of us are quite comfortable being whatever we are with our warts and beauty marks, everything, all together there. We're quite content. We have to begin to see that, yeah, there's a better way to be in the world. And that may come from others being an example for us. So when we talk about, may I place others in happiness, may I free them from suffering, initially it means, may I be true to my own path and developing my own self so I can be a sort of guiding example for others and maybe help them even indirectly initially until I'm more skillful and wise to be able to help them more directly. So I think that's the idea behind it. But thanks for bringing that up too. Does that help? Yeah. Let's go back to what we're doing here. I'm glad these questions came up because it gives us a chance to, yeah, digest and see where there might be some gaps. So I appreciate you bringing these up. I'm going to go through these a little bit more quickly, but know that there are a lot of resources for some of these, particularly patience. Patience is a big one. It's actually one of the main practices of bodhisattva, a being who is intent on becoming a Buddha. And patience counters our anger. Whereas loving kindness is more directed at hatred towards beings. Here we develop love towards beings. With patience, it's the mind of anger that can be upset about anything, not even sometimes people. Sometimes we get upset because our devices aren't working right. Something's going weird, going haywire on an app or whatever, and we might throw our phone at the wall because we're angry at it, right? And that's pretty powerful force in our world. And there are some times when anger can be positive in terms of helping to address social justice issues and inequities and unfairness in our society. But patience is the ability to remain internally calm and undisturbed in the face of harm or difficulties. So you can still have this kind of motivation to do something about things in the world from that place of calm. And if you don't, then that frequently becomes problematic. So the Sanskrit word that is used to translate as patience is shanti. Shanti has no suitable equivalence in English, or suitable equivalent in English. And she says, here we use patience, but Shanti also includes tolerance, internal calm, endurance. So, as I said, when you have an anger that is about rectifying injustice in the world, all those qualities are needed, right? Look at Mahatma Gandhi and his whole campaign of nonviolence, right? He knew that he had to have a tolerance of the other side, an internal calm, an endurance, stability, a fortitude, all of that to get through to what he wanted to accomplish. The mind of anger was antithetical to that campaign. And of course, it worked over time because that's the way we actually accomplish things. All right. Thus, patience as it is used here also includes these qualities. Patience does not involve pasting a plastic smile on our face while hatred simmers inside. Though, as I said the other night, sometimes we have to fake it till we make it. So as long as we are doing what we can to avoid getting to a place of really deep anger, I think that's a good thing. But recognize that you might be still suppressing it and stuffing it in, and you have to do the work on the cushion to be better able to contend with that when you're actually in a situation. But it is most important at the beginning to stop saying and doing the things that are going to be harmful in our world. If you stop yelling at people and, wanting to punch people in the face, whatever, start there with the grosser forms of it, and then begin to work on your mind and calming your own mind. What was it our parents all told us? They always said, be patient, be patient, be patient, but I never got any instruction. Maybe some of you got instruction, but sometimes we were told to count to 10, right? And that's a bit of what Frankel was talking about, right? You have a little gap between the stimulus and how you respond. Sometimes just stepping back and counting to 10 is a wonderful thing to do, just to say, okay, I'm just going to sit here but you can't sit there all 10, getting angrier and angrier. That's not going to work. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then suddenly you just burst at 10. That's not the point. The point is to have some distance again, so we can develop a better way of responding. There are many tools to help address anger. There's a wonderful book, that one that was cited there for the quotes on patience, Working with Anger by Venerable Thupten Chodron, a wonderful nun in our tradition. It involves the dissolving the anger energy so that it is no longer there. Then, with a clear mind, we can evaluate various alternatives and decide what to say or do to remedy a situation. So we do have to have a tool to dismantle the anger, to kind of bring the temperature down, have a more rational way of looking at things. And then often we can put our energy into how to actually address what's going on. So, there's solutions to a lot of things in our world. Not everything has a solution, but we'll get to that place if we don't have anger. So the meditation I would encourage you, I'm just giving you 3 things that you can work with that are relatively easy, but still can be challenging. Recalling an object of anger in your life, or whatever you want to, anger can be spite, it can be, some aversion, it can be anything that is in that flavor tone. Try to cultivate patience through either seeing the disadvantages of anger and the benefits of patience. Those are spelled out more clearly by Venerable Chodron, but the idea is we can see the disadvantages of anger in our daily life if we just think about it. Who likes to be angry? Anybody in the room like to be angry? I find that my mind starts going there. It's hard to think. It's hard to rationalize. I don't feel good. Might even get sick to my stomach. It's not a good place to be. They say over the long term, people who have anger a lot and even suffer from heart attacks and things because it's just stressful. Blood pressure goes up, everything, right? Number 2, viewing the situation in a more positive light. This is a way that I encourage people to frame things, especially difficult situations. Is this something I can actually learn from, something I can grow from? I mean, I don't want to go so far to say everything happens for a reason. I think that's an overused kind of generalization. But if we say, okay, this challenging thing is coming into my life, I want to see what I can learn from this. I want to see how I can grow from working with this situation. And it's just an alternative to having anger, because we can see that being patient and not reacting in the habitual ways of getting angry at things is not going to be positive at all. And we have to try to see that there's something else that we can do with that situation. In Tibetan Buddhism, we use these techniques called lojong, where we're primarily trying to work with how to change a difficult situation into something that feeds our spiritual practice. Very powerful practice, but again, this one's a little bit harder. But number 3, understanding the myriad other causes involved in the situation. This gets into that whole realm of one of the most basic Buddhist teachings, which is interdependence. Nothing arises on its own. Anything is a product, anything we deal with is a product of very many different causes and conditions that give rise to it. So you can narrowly focus on one thing and say, this is the problem. Like even the gun violence situation in this country. People like to point, okay, the problem is the guns. No, the problem is mental health. No, the problem is lack of security. We need to arm all the teachers, or whatever. They point to different things, but it's a combination of things, right? No one thing is going to do the trick because it's a very complex situation. So anything we experience arises from a variety of causes and conditions, but we are tending to, with the mind of anger, hone in on this one thing or one person and thinking they're the problem, and I have to do away with them, and then I'll be free of the problem. But it doesn't work that way, So again, this is understanding, and in Buddhist terms, we would even say that our karma is part of the causes of that problem. Why do we have that problem in our lives? Because we've created the karma for that. And karma applies to our good experiences, our bad experiences, everything. So there's a different framing of it when we say, okay, I helped create this. Maybe not in the moment, but by something I did in the past. This is now coming to my doorstep, and I've got to deal with this. I've got to figure out what to learn from this, how to work with this. Again, it's feeding it back into that other reason as well. But this is a very powerful way of working with our habitual reaction of anger and trying to replace it with a mind that's more patient, more calm, at peace. Again, there's a lot more from Venerable Chodron on working with that. In the whole book, she goes through a variety of different techniques to help calm our anger. A practice that I would encourage you to do occasionally is thinking specifically about a difficult person in your life. Try to see things from their side and cultivate patience towards them. We often, when we look at people, we attribute so much more kind of control of their minds to them than what we even have ourselves. Like we think that these people must be doing this because they want to do this, that they're harming us or saying things that we are opposed to because that is, I don't know, again, a greater power in them or something. We don't see the degree to which they are struggling with their minds in the same way that we are, or they are under the control of their own past ways of thinking that we are. We have to see that what it must be like for somebody to be as cruel as they are, for example, or as uncaring as they are. And then we might get a deeper appreciation for what it's like to be them. I was told that too when I was a kid, right? That you should walk a mile in someone else's shoes before you criticize them or what have you. We don't know the stories of these beings. There's that phrase, I can't remember who that one's by, about the stories of our enemies that they could tell us are just way beyond our belief even. Everyone is walking around carrying a heavy load, a heavy burden, and we're kind of blind to that. So particularly with the people who are difficult, try to occasionally do that practice to see if we can maybe see what it must be like for them. They're probably not very happy campers. Mindfulness, once we work with this a bit, try to see whatever you encounter that is challenging as an opportunity to choose the peacefulness of the patient mind. To say, okay, what can I apply? How can I work with this at this time? To say, I'm not going to let this disturb me. I'm not going to let this upset me. And what's the wonderful thing about that too is you're going to be in a much better position to try to deal with things more constructively when you've done that, right? If we're flustered and angered, forget it. Humility, these last ones I'll go through pretty quickly. This is a quote from C.S. Lewis. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. Sometimes we have the vision that humility means, that we're a doormat. It counters pride because when we have a pride or self-importance that thinks that it's all about us, humility brings us back down to ground, and says, guess what? It's not all about you. And so we should be thinking of others and not about ourselves so much. But it's also described in this way by Brene Brown in her Atlas of the Heart. She says, humility is openness to new learning, combined with a balanced and accurate assessment of our contributions, meaning we're not going to get prideful about what we've done, but we'll be honest about what we've done, including our strengths, imperfections, and opportunities for growth. So humility becomes more of this openness to saying, yeah, I mean, I need to be in a position of learning. The prideful mind comes up when we think we know it all, right? No one else is going to teach us anything. In Tibet, they often say that the prideful mind is like being on the mountaintops. You know, on the mountaintops of the Himalayas, you're well above the tree line. There's no trees there whatsoever. Nothing grows there because it's all up in the arid climate of the mountaintops. Of course, a lot of snow on the mountaintops too, but there's nothing growing. And of course, what happens with the snow that's on the mountaintops? It goes down into the valleys. The valleys are extremely lush. I spent a little bit of time in Tibet in 1994, and the greens of the valleys and everything are just amazing. So beautiful. You want to be like that. You don't want to be like that up on the mountaintop with the sense of pride looking down on everybody, but rather like the valleys down below, even feeling like, I can learn from everybody. I can look at everybody as a teacher in some way and have that kind of humility. So this is a very powerful one. Again, we don't talk about it maybe quite as much in some of our Buddhist teachings, but examine your own pride or self-importance regarding the various qualities or good things you possess and see the interdependence of those. I said that in regard to the previous one. Interdependence is a big factor, right? Because it means that we didn't do everything on our own. There's nobody who's like a self-made millionaire or a self-made genius or anything. We all depend upon others for whatever. I mean, you wouldn't know how to use utensils if your parents hadn't taught you how to do that, or someone who raised you, right? So everything we learn from others. People are intimately involved in our welfare. Let me kind of move forward. We're running out of time. When you're in the in the company of another, practice trying not to hold yourself as superior and to deeply appreciate that person. And then as a mindfulness exercise, whenever you encounter others, try to maintain an awareness of how to think of them and their needs, and even try to think about how you might serve them. Again, if we're going to be down at that lowly place of the valley, well, then our job is to kind of support and help others, and to really have that attitude of I'm here as a servant, not as someone who needs to be served by other people. Forgiveness. There's a whole lot of practices on forgiveness. Jack Kornfield has a wonderful practice involving self-forgiveness and forgiving others. This is a quick little definition. Forgiveness means reclaiming peace of mind by letting go of anger towards someone who has done something that feels hurtful or disturbing. Learning to forgive doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means making a new start. This counters our resentment, In Buddhism, we often use this phrase that to be resentful of another person waiting is like carrying around a hot coal waiting to throw at them because they offended you, right? Well, who's getting burned by carrying around a hot coal, Just ourselves. So why would we want that burning fire of resentment in us when we can let it go through some process of forgiveness? We might have to work at this to accomplish that with regard to some harms, but nonetheless, it is possible to get to that place. And it should begin with self-forgiveness. And then when we're ready, forgiveness for others. And you can do these similar types of phrases, I forgive you. I understand why you did what you did and so on. Remember that we all have faults. We all make mistakes. We all do things that harm others on occasion. And we're all thus worthy of forgiveness. As a practice, think about people who are harming others in our world and see if you can find some space in your heart to forgive them. Here, they might not be harming you directly, but can you even cultivate some thoughts of forgiving them for being that horrible person in our world that's doing a lot of negative things? Again, our forgiveness may not mean a lot at that point, but it's a test for us can we extend our heart to those people who are doing things that are really atrocious? And then whenever you encounter others, try to see them as beings who are separate from their actions. I'm going to say this real quickly because this is one of the most basic things for practicing forgiveness. His Holiness emphasizes this all the time. When we see a person engage in something that is harmful towards us or anyone else, we can understand that they are not their actions. Their actions are coming about through their own crazy mind and delusions. But we can see them as somewhat separate from that. so that we acknowledge that we can have, it's a bit like in Christianity where they say, I can love the sinner but hate the sin. It's a similar type of thing, not absolutely, but we can say we love these beings, we care about these beings, and we will forgive these beings, but we will take offense at the actions that they've done and acknowledge that they are harms. That's why you are forgiving them for it, because you see that they are not those actions. So let me go through these last few somewhat quickly. I'm sorry, I'm once more a little over-prepared. Contentment. Contentment, we don't, again, talk about that much in Buddhism, but this counters our dissatisfaction, that kind of mind that is always looking for something else to satisfy us. It's a bit of the, the Apple iPhone mind, right? You always want that new model because you get dissatisfied with the old one and you want something new that does something more and different and whatever. Contentment teaches us to feel at peace with things just as they are. It is a state of well-being, satisfaction, and ease that arises when craving is absent. To feel content, we must be released, if only temporarily, from wanting something other than what is right here, right now. It's from Oren J. Sofer, a book he wrote, fairly recent book. It's quite nice. I'm not going to go through that. I think it's pretty easy to get the meditation on this. You'll have time to read this when these get distributed. Think about practice might be sitting in your room observing something you own with an appreciation of it and a feeling of having enough. That's what contentment very much is about. I don't need to have that mind of acquiring things and getting more. Just being content with what you have. And try to hold that feeling of being satisfied with your life throughout each day. Gratitude is very much related to contentment, but it's a different level of feeling tone to it. Gratitude is an emotion that reflects on our deep appreciation for what we value, what brings meaning to our lives, what makes us feel connected to ourselves and others. This is from Robert Emmons. He's an expert on gratitude, written several books, and researched it extensively. So again, it goes beyond just kind of what we have and really looking at a gratefulness for everything that life affords us. Brother David Stondal-Rast, who is a Benedictine monk, he says that, we can have gratitude, gratefulness in every moment, because every moment is an opportunity. So again, I've got a little gratitude exercise that you can do there. I think that's pretty easy. At some point each day, reflect on 3 things that you can be grateful for, and if you wish, you can write them down in a gratitude journal. This comes from the Book of Joy that I mentioned earlier. And then there's a little exercise that Brother David, who I mentioned just a few seconds ago, has called Stop, Look, Go. And I'll include this with the slides. I'll have a little sheet on that. But essentially what it means is, and it might have something to remind you. I have the idea of like a gratitude stone. Maybe you put a stone in your pocket or somewhere, or even on a necklace. And then whenever you touch it or become aware of it, then it reminds you to practice this. Stop, look, and go means you have to stop. We're going faster than my speaking tonight through most of our day, right? We're doing all these things, running all over, doing all these things. We have to stop occasionally and just be still. That's a big practice right there already. Then he says, look, meaning kind of just, you don't have to like look visually. You just stop and become aware of the richness of that moment. What it is that you have, something you can be grateful for. And then you go from that place of gratitude. He modeled this after the advice we were given as children as well about when we get to a busy street, right? You stop, you look, and then you go, when it's safe to go. So anyway, nice little practice. Let me do number 10 and then we'll see if there are any last questions. We're already 1 minute over here. Generosity. Generosity is a really positive emotion that is so important because it counteracts our miserliness and our kind of holding to everything so tightly that we have. So it's a mind that wants to give. Not only directly helps others, but also releases the pain and miserliness and fills our mind with joy. They actually talk about 4 ways that we can practice giving in Buddhism, not just giving material possessions or money, which is how we often think of generosity, but giving protection, meaning helping others who need some intervention in order to help them be safe and what have you. Giving love, that's a bit like loving kindness, what we talked about earlier, and then giving dharma or spiritual teachings. Where we can, try to help others. Again, back to Jandy's question, there will be times when some people might be open to hearing spiritual teachings and sometimes where they're not. Even if you don't consider yourself a teacher, like me sitting here in this role, you still can teach others through example, through even asking them, well, I see what you're going through is really difficult. I have some teachings that I got from a teacher that some teaching I went to. Are you interested in hearing that? Offer it. Some people may say no, that's okay. But I like this one too from the Book of Joy. It can also involve helping others to be more joyful through the generosity of your own spirit. Seek to be an oasis of caring and concern as you live your life. I wanted to end with this one because I think this is a very amazing way to be in the world. Again, what His Holiness and the Archbishop demonstrate. Archbishop, of course, passed away recently, but simply smiling at others as you walk down the street can make an enormous difference in the quality of human interaction in your community. People may look at you weird when you're smiling at them. I mean, I've gotten in the habit, I go walking every day in Santa Fe, most days. I wouldn't say every day, but most days I go out there and I try to go out pretty early in the morning. And when school is coming back in the fall and it's in the spring, there's all these cars coming into our neighborhood because we have a school, an elementary school. And so I just try waving and smiling at everybody. And, if they don't smile or wave, that's fine. I don't need them to do that. I'm just trying to come from that place of just being some source of, that's a bit of protection we're giving others, right? Because they know that we don't mean them any harm, right? That we're actually having some goodwill, some benevolence towards them. So I don't know. Don't worry about being embarrassed, and hopefully you won't wave at somebody and smile at somebody who takes offense. That could probably happen, but just trust in the practice. So reflect on these 4 ways of being generous, how you've engaged in any of these or are, and then also trying to think about how you might increase your generosity. When you are experiencing something pleasurable, try holding thoughts of giving that pleasure to others. And then throughout your day, become aware of the many small ways that you can be generous, especially this last one, by sharing your joy and happiness with others. And that's where I'm concluding tonight. I remember in the Book of Joy how the Archbishop said, we need people who come from that joyous place in our world. We need people who have generated these types of skills and abilities that I've shared with you, tonight in particular. That's what we need in our world is compassionate, loving, kind, generous, patient beings who can exhibit that to the world and share that with the world. So I hope you all can do that. That's your homework from now until the end of your life and beyond. So, any other questions or comments online or yes, Suhas?
Hello. Yeah. I was expecting the first one would be get a Labrador puppy or a Golden Retriever puppy, but
That
that's
could be a
fine.
great source of happiness.
That's fine. The other 10 will do. No, I really found these 10 and the practice and the way you talked about it extremely practical to the point that I feel like if I just stop listening to any other Dharma talk or going to any meditation center or temples, just work on these 10, I'll be good. So I really appreciate. Thanks for coming
very
to the Bay Area.
Again, and I'll just add, keep in mind that this is really the method side of the path. There still is the wisdom that we haven't talked about, really. So, I mean, I like focusing on this in many, venues because I think this is stuff we can get right now. The wisdom side of it is a little bit deeper and a little bit harder to cultivate, but just recognize that it's not the full picture, but it's at least something that, again, if you practiced all 10 of these, if you were the embodiment of those 10 qualities, that positive emotions that you are exhibiting to the world, it'd be outstanding. I mean, it would be like being the Dalai Lama or Mother Teresa or all these wonderful beings who have been just real lights in our world. So thank you. Yes, yes, please.
Going about this daily practice,
Mm-hmm.
I have found myself in moments of resistance. While I know that I want to show, for example, some compassion, I also find that there is a bit of resistance with that,
Sure.
whether it's own feelings or thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, in these moments, I'm also just noting the feeling and trying to proceed forward with that compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Is that just kind of how we go about that? Just noting the feeling and trying to move forward?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up because if we weren't feeling the resistance, then again, we'd already have it completely. And that's not the starting point for most of us, right? We don't have hearts that are completely open to the suffering of the world or anything. When we see that resistance, it's indicative of where the boundary is that we need to kind of push through and push against. And not in a rough way. We're talking about always, once more, having that self-compassion. What I would encourage when you're experiencing that is certainly investigate it and see, okay, where is that resistance coming from? What is it that is happening? Is it that I don't feel I have the capacity for that, or whatever other judgments we might be having going on? And that's okay to just kind of go through an investigation and analyze. But then perhaps to turn to the self-compassion practice and just say, having resistance to opening my heart, this is a difficult place to be. This is a suffering moment. That second thing, of recognizing that's part of our shared humanity, that is part of being a human being, is that we don't have these capacities at that degree. We have to work on them gradually and encounter our own resistance. And then the last one, that we be kind to ourselves in that moment, that we actually say, oh, may you be free of this resistance. May you be able to open your heart fully. May you, be alleviated of that difficulty, that pain. And it's a wonderful way to just treat ourselves like we would anyone else who would come to us and say, I'm having that problem, and we'd want to nurture them and help them. So again, there's probably some lessons in there that we can get by picking it apart, but I also want to be conscious of that emotive quality, that this is good to see our own resistances, our own walls, our own barriers that help us to know where we're at and what we need to work on. So that would be my comment on that. Does that help a little bit, or do you have further questions? Or yeah, but that's great. I mean, think of how many people don't even look at their minds to know where their resistances are, right? That's why I always want to make sure that people get that congratulatory thing about it too. When you see that we got the resistance, that doesn't mean I should narrow in on that and hone in on that and think that that's who I am now, is this horrible place of resistance. No, it's wonderful that you've actually seen that. You're actually coming at this practice and trying to work with it and trying to develop your qualities. And so see that that's a good thing that you see those resistances, not that it's a horrible thing that we have them. Everything. What I think Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and can't remember if that was in the Book of Joy. He says you don't become fearless without fear, right? How do you become fearless? But by facing your fears. You have to have fears to start with. That's the same thing with regard to this way of developing our minds. When we see resistance or blockages or things that are getting in the way, that's what we need to be experiencing in order to move the extra distance, in order to do the additional work. So be very kind to yourself, and just, that's part of the process. So it's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. Yeah. Anyone else, or you might want to close. We're already at 8:41. So let's just have a moment of dedication like we did the other night. We want to think back on this hour and a half, or even again, if those of you who took part in Monday's class as well, all of this work that we've done in looking at positive emotions, both from a Western perspective as well as the Buddha's teachings on how we develop these more positive qualities and emotions. And we're doing this so that we can change our own minds. So we dedicate for the development of all these qualities in ourselves, so we can become this source of joy and happiness for the world and for everyone we meet. And we do it with also the wish that other beings may be able to cultivate these same qualities, same positive emotions, and completely develop their own minds into that same state that we are striving for. We dedicate for the good health and long lives of our spiritual teachers who are helping us, especially His Holiness the Dalai Lama, whose guiding influence we need in this world so badly. And also for the swift return of our spiritual director and our organization here, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, so that we can be reunited with his presence and guidance in this world. Then lastly, dedicate for beings you're holding in your heart. And you might even test this right now. Like, think about beings who are close to you who are going through difficulty, but maybe even include one or two beings who are going through a tough time who you don't care for so much. And see if you can share this positive energy with them, kind of send it out so that they too have all their suffering alleviated completely. and also that we send out everything that will help them to find complete happiness, complete well-being. And may this be so for all beings through what we have done here tonight and last session.